What we witnessed at the Emirates was special. It was more than just Arsenal versus Bayern. It was an exhibition of one of the sharpest tactical evolutions in recent football history. And merely looking at this as a one-off encounter is a disservice, as it was a display of what elite teams in 2025 look to do defensively and how attacking teams have been forced to adapt to this to try and conquer the modern defense. So this will be a slightly different tactical analysis, but let's get into it. Between 2017 and roughly 2024, the most effective strategy for top teams in possession was clear, and it centered around positional play. And if you watched any elite team, they would probably have lined up in a 2-3-5 or a 3-2-5 in possession. Why was that? Well, most teams were defending zonally in either a 4-3-3, a 4-2-3-1, or a 4-4-2. The point is, the positional play approach was the ideal system to take advantage of these areas of confusion where zones overlap. For example, the half space, who should pick up the player here? Or the false nines, who should pick up the player here? Arsenal versus Bayern emphasized that defensive teams now have a new approach, which is threatening to make positional play redundant. Because what do you see in both of these scenarios? Look where Bayern's centre-backs are in the press, as well as Arsenal's centre-backs. Both teams employed aggressive man-to-man pressing structures, and if you look at many teams around Europe in 2025, aggressive man-to-man pressing has become the norm. Because this sort of pressing system eliminates those ambiguous in-between zones that positional play takes advantage of, because instead, every defender is clear on who they're picking up. So where in the past, when a false nine, for example, dropped deep, a centre-back would initially follow deep before eventually having to communicate with the midfielder to take over as they continue to drop deep. Now we see a whole lot of this instead. I mean, just look at Upamecano here, dropping deep with Merino, the false nine. But crucially, he stays high up the pitch, instructing his teammate to cover for him so that he can remain touch tight and apply immediate pressure as soon as Merino gets on the ball. And it goes both ways, because Arsenal's pressing shape generally looked like this, with Eze high up on one centre-back and Merino on the other, so that they could apply man-to-man pressure on the centre-backs. But with Eze, a midfielder, this high, it meant that Bayern with their midfield three would have had a man free. But what happens instead? Mosquera pushes all the way up to keep that man-to-man orientation. And that's before even mentioning Saliba, who's also pushing up to back up the press onto the dropping Kane, meaning that for a moment, there's a huge chasm where the centre-backs should be. But Arsenal are okay with this because it allows them to maintain their man-oriented press. So why is this man-oriented press so effective? Well, we've touched on the first reason, being that there is no more ambiguity on who should be picking up who. But often, the positional play approach emphasized players in possession maintaining their structure, but the man-to-man approach means that every single player is receiving under immense pressure, meaning that the side in possession is either losing the ball, being forced long, or backwards. So does this mean that this is the perfect defensive system? Well, it's proved to be pretty effective at stifling creativity in open play, which is a big reason that the set piece is becoming more and more important. If you can't break them down through pretty patterns, it makes sense to focus on set piece superiority. And we saw Arsenal take full advantage of this in this match. But even in open play, we are already seeing teams in possession hunt for ways to break down the man-to-man system. And Arsenal and Bayern showcased exactly how most teams are looking to do this. Way is through extreme rotations. Traditionally, especially early in the build-up, positional play approaches prioritized roughly maintaining the structure and letting the ball do the work of progressing up the pitch. But the antidote to man marking might be rotations around the pitch, with players switching positions so often that it firstly makes it difficult for defenders to track their man, and even if they do, they're being forced to defend in positions they're not comfortable in. And in fact, this was one of the chief ways that Arsenal looked to break Bayern down. Mainly through Timber pushing wide, allowing Merino to drop in, while Saka moves central, so that he can potentially use his pace in behind if the centre-back does follow his man deep. But rotations are commonplace in any system in modern football, and even positional sides had a lot of rotations, albeit while broadly looking to maintain their structure. So teams in possession have simply started to broadly abandon their structure when they had the ball, instead looking for overloads around the ball to force the opposition into decisions. Because if teams suddenly abandon their man-to-man system, the side with the ball now has a free man and can progress almost effortlessly. But if they follow, they're leaving defensive vulnerabilities elsewhere. Now, this match showed that this can go both ways, as often we saw Arsenal drop Merino into the midfield, and Upamecano was fearless in following his man no matter where he went, as when Saka would look to exploit this gap, Lima would stick to his man, meaning that the space never actually emerged. But we also saw how teams in possession can drag the defensive shape apart, as due to being man-to-man, it means that the centre-backs both need to have a man in close proximity. So if there is no immediate forward, they have to push extremely high up the pitch, creating more room in behind that teams can attack. Like we see here, as Tar and Upamecano push high on the Arsenal forwards, who have dropped extremely deep, and we see that room begin to emerge in the backline that Arsenal can potentially attack through, although once again, the man orientation means that Lima is able to track the run of Saka. Or similarly, when Bayern look to overload their right-hand half space, we see both Arsenal centre-backs are dragged across with their respective number. And because Timber remains man-oriented on his man on the outside, rather than staying close to his centre-back, it means gaps like this can develop to potentially be taken advantage of. And in fact, Martinelli's goal perhaps exposed situations that can be taken advantage of against pressing systems like this. Granted, it does come from a Bayern attack, but Upamecano and Tar find themselves in the same positions they have been in all match, which is marking Marino and Eze. So again, that chasm behind the centre-backs emerges, and the only difference is that this time, Martinelli makes the most of it. But there is also an elephant in the room. Man-to-man systems mean built-in isolations, which is fine when players are receiving under pressure deep on the pitch here. But if the side in possession is able to progress, a man-to-man in scenarios like this is an isolation, and tricky wingers are often able to beat fullbacks and get into goal-scoring positions, though neither team made the most of these situations in this game.